Okay, so Dr. Moat, thank you very much. And I'm pretty sure during this workshop, your comments will be reflected on, perhaps referenced to, and I'm sure in some cases it may be debated, which I know you would want to have it that way. But I think his comments clearly set the stage for the workshop. Now, what I like to do is sort of outline our next steps. And you heard from John Liu that for the balance of this afternoon, we will cover 3 sessions. And just as a reminder, my name is Rod Adkins, and I will cover the first session. And the first session will be on the topic, the educational and career pathways of engineering talent. So we will sort of dissect this topic, and we're going to do it in 2 parts. The first part, and our first presenters, we'll have some presenters, we'll have respondents, and we'll actually have some time for Q&A, so we're going to sort of follow that format throughout this afternoon. And our first presenters were actually consultants to our study committee, and we have 2, Donna Ginther and Shulamit Kahn. Donna is professor and as part of the Department of Economics for the University of Kansas. And Shu is a professor and part of the Department of Finance and Economics for the School of Management, Boston University. And in your workshop folder, there are more details in terms of their backgrounds, their overall bios. And so I would encourage you, when you have an opportunity, to look at that in more detail. What they will be presenting is, and they'll be speaking to some data that they've actually collected, assembled, and analyzed. And it was at the request of the study committee. And as part of this, they'll be, at the conclusion of this workshop, they'll be providing us a commissioned paper. Now, what I would like to do is, as they talk, and they're going to have about 35 minutes, and we will reserve time for questions. If you have a question, hopefully it's in the spirit of clarifying questions, because we will have time for more dialogue and questions after their presentation. So with that, I'd like to bring up both Donna and Shu.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. We're going to be sort of splitting up the presentation, and I will kick it off. So we're following the objectives that were set out for the committee. We're going to collect and synthesize data on engineers and look at the distinction between those with engineering degrees and working in engineering or engineering-related occupations in the U.S. And the first part will talk about the degrees and their demographic characteristics. And then objective 2 is to look at factors that influence the career pathways and how careers progress over time for people who have either the engineering training or the engineering occupation. And along with that, we're going to evaluate job satisfaction, job mobility, and what engineers actually do. Now, Shu and I study the scientific workforce, and to preview our results, the story about engineering is a very positive and happy one. Tomorrow I'll be presenting information to another National Research Council committee on the biomedical workforce where the story is not so pleasant. Before I begin and describe the data, these data we rely on are collected by the National Science Foundation. I did not put the NSF disclaimer. The NSF does not take responsibility for any of our results. They're scattered throughout the audience and smiling at the recognition. Now, this is the science and engineering data workforce data, CSTAT, and it's probably the most rich data on careers and workforce that is collected in this country. To me, it's Shu and I have built our research around these data. And we use the 2003 to 2010 waves, but we specifically lean heavily on the 2010 data. The nice thing about these data, they're comprehensive information on education degrees, majors, occupation, and employment history. It follows people over time. We're not going to really rely on the longitudinal aspects of the data for this presentation, but we will incorporate some of those characteristics into our final paper. And in our opinion, it's the best data available for understanding the science and education workforce relationships. At the beginning, and in my next slides, I will be presenting information on degrees, and these data come from the NSF-hosted website, WebCasper, which aggregates data from the IPEDS, which is collected by the Department of Education, and the survey of earned doctorates collected by the NSF. So let's talk a little bit about degrees. I've got lots of bar charts. Engineering is green. It's large. If we look at engineering-related fields such as computer science, mathematics, statistics, and physics, it's much larger, and it's growing. It's larger than those other fields combined. Within engineering, you get a lot of variation in the size. So the light green, the dark green is aerospace at the bottom, which is rather small. The orange is electrical, which is the largest field. Mechanical is the second largest, and biomedical other in these slides are combined. In later slides, they're broken out. So in terms of growth, I'll show you growth statistics later. Looking at master's degrees, twice as many bachelor's degrees in engineering as there are master's degrees. But again, compared to fields that are closely related to engineering, you see that engineering is the 800-pound gorilla in terms of these technical, math-intensive fields. And you see very similar patterns in terms of specific engineering fields in master's degrees as you did in the bachelor's degrees. And the master's degrees have almost doubled since 2000. So there's a lot of growth in the master's degree. We don't really emphasize PhDs in this study, but there are a lot of PhDs in engineering in this audience and on the committee, and PhD degrees are very similar to the bachelor's and master's. Again, the PhD fields within engineering look very similar. Growth in PhD degrees happens to be the largest in biomedicine. And this really sort of summarizes the previous slides. You look at fields, there's been tremendous growth in aerospace, but recall that it's a very small portion of overall engineering. Chemical has had about a 40% growth between 2000 and 2013. And you do see a lot of growth in biomedical right here. I'm supposed to do this right here. So you see significant growth in biomedical. And master's degrees tend to be growing, or advanced degrees in like biomedical materials have grown quite a bit. So engineering is expanding, all right? And so what are the implications of this expansion of engineering? It really hasn't, and we'll show in later slides that it really hasn't we don't see evidence of an excess supply of engineers. This is another way to think about how the degrees are related. The purple is electrical and computer. It's almost 40% of master's degrees, 32% of bachelor's, and 30% of doctorates. You see growth in the other fields. Other fields include nuclear, petroleum, materials, environmental. And aerospace is steady growth. You see an expansion of doctorates in chemical relative to lesser degrees. Now, when we look at the demographics, one of the things that's changing about America's workforce and America's population is that our population is becoming more diverse. The state of California is majority minority, meaning that white people are less than 50% of the population in California. And so we need to think about gender and race going forward. Often, Shu and I have worked on gender differences in science careers, and engineering is always at the bottom, right? It's always lags behind the rest of the STEM disciplines in the number of people who are majoring in engineering. But when we saw this result, it was very surprising to us that there's a lot of heterogeneity in gender representation across the fields. Biomedical, as in life science fields, you see 50% of the degrees are being awarded to women, or over in the case of bachelors. You see about 35 to 40% of degrees in biomedical. You see a sizable representation of women in chemical and industrial. Aerospace is an outlier, and it will be an outlier when we talk about race. It is the bastion of white male engineers. It is very different, and the woman from Boeing sitting next to me is nodding her head in in recognition. To me, it's very interesting and surprising that there's so much variation across field. Shouldn't have been surprising, but it is. And this is a result that is well known, but it's very dramatic in this slide. Bachelor's degrees, by and large, most of them, with the exception of electrical and civil, are going to US-born students. But when you go to the higher degrees, you see that the master's and the PhD especially, half of PhDs in engineering, engineers with civil and architectural degrees in engineering in 2010, half are foreign-born. Similarly in electrical and computer engineering. So very high rates of advanced degrees going to foreign-born students, which has implications for immigration policy in this country. When we think about race, ethnicity, you see that the 70% of bachelor's degrees in engineering go to white, non-Hispanic whites. Lesser extent goes to master's and doctorate, and you see an expansion of Asians. And I would say we haven't done the breakout, but a sizable proportion of these are probably foreign-born, so immigrants. So you see about 10% of Hispanic bachelor's degrees go to Hispanic, and you go at advanced degrees. The diversity with respect to historically underrepresented groups in this country, Hispanics and blacks, goes down. And you break it across fields again, as we do in this graph, and you see that biomedical, chemical, electrical, engineering fields are more racially diverse. And as I mentioned before, aerospace, civil, and mechanical are much less diverse. So you can't, when Shu and I have done work on other fields, we always say you can't combine STEM into a monolith. And it's true, you can't combine engineering into a monolith. You have to think about the different fields and break it into separate markets. You see very similar patterns by race in the master's. And in the PhD, again, this sizable portion is likely immigrants. So to summarize engineering degrees, engineering is a large and growing field. At the PhD level, engineering is growing more quickly. Actually, these are results from my other presentation tomorrow, but engineering is growing more quickly than life science, physical sciences, and social sciences. So engineering is expanding. Each field within engineering features different levels of diversity by gender and race. And aerospace is less diverse, whereas chemical is more. And diversity increases with advanced degrees, most likely because of foreign students. And now I will turn it over to Shu for the next part.
Thanks, Donna. Did you take the clicker with you?
Yes, I did. Of course.
Hi, I'm going to talk first about leaving engineering, which I know is a big part of everybody's concerns. Yes, they get their degrees, but do they stay in engineering? What are they doing if they're not? So just a few definitions that we'll be using in the slides. We talk about working in engineering, and then there we mean really working in the fields that have been defined in the data as engineering, not engineering related. However, we did add in a new field that was new in the 2000s that was added called engineering management. So the management of engineering we included as working in engineering. Engaged in engineering is the same thing, but it adds people who, especially early in their careers, you might want to know maybe they're not working in engineering, but they're going to school in engineering, so that just adds those people in. But we would like to say that there are engineering-related occupations, and so we're going to really show you that as well. And that really follows through on what Dr. Moat was talking about, as you will see. These are occupations that are not classically defined as engineering occupations per se. You don't have a necessarily need a degree in engineering, although many of the people we see who work in these do have degrees in engineering. But for instance, one of these is electrical, electronic, industrial, mechanical technicians. So that makes them not engineers because they are officially technicians. So the first question is, where are they working? We have two different pie charts. One is the job sector of those whose highest degree is a BA or MA in engineering. That's the population. The other one is the population slightly different because any degree in engineering, any BA or MA, so that would include people who went on to get an MBA after they had an engineering degree. They're not that different in many senses. So what we think is that the key facts from these pie charts are less than a half of those whose highest degree is in engineering are in engineering occupations, and that's even smaller if any of their degrees were in engineering. However, you have to think about adding in the orange sector, which is working in computer-related or engineering-related fields. Those things that some people might think, well, maybe that's the same as engineering. And that's the field that Dr. Moat perhaps was talking about. If you add that in, there still are a substantial number of people whose occupations are not considered as being engineering-related, computer-related. Over a third of them, up to 40% if you include people whose highest degree might not be engineering as long as one was. So there are substantial numbers of people who are not working in either engineering or computers or engineering related degrees, 36 to 40%, depending on how you cut it. This takes a different population, a different pie. This is a pie of something different. This says of the occupations that are considered to be engineering occupations, what are their degrees in? What is their highest degree in? And you can see that the 3/4 of them have highest degrees in engineering. A few have highest degrees in computers or engineering related. But 21%, which I believe is very similar to the number that Dr. Moat was talking about, have other highest degrees in other fields. And I thought this was interesting, so I looked at some of these fields, and they're quite a wide variety of fields. Some of them are social sciences, some of them are graphics, things like that. Obviously, as people's careers develop, they are perhaps less likely to stay in the occupation that they started in the field that they got their degrees in. So here we follow those with whose, we're not using, in most of what I'm talking about, we've excluded the PhDs. Occasionally we bring them in. But these are the BA, I'm sorry, that's my mistake. When I say BA, I mean bachelor's and master's. I changed it everywhere, but clearly not here. These are the bachelor's and master's in engineering. And how many of them are engaged in engineering, mostly working, some of them still studying, as the time from their degree, their last degree increases. So to begin with, you see about 70% of them, and then they start to drop off somewhat, but mostly the drop-off seems to occur 7 to 10 years later, and so it kind of stabilizes at 40%. This is the only thing you'll see that's truly longitudinal. We hope to do more in later stages of our report. But this is following the same people over time. This is in 2010, perhaps these people from different cohorts, and there were cohort effects. This is a single cohort who we first see in the 2000s, sometime in the 2000s, following them through time. And so most of these people, we see them within few years of their degree, and by the end of this graph, they're an additional 4 to 5 years later. So this mostly is within the first 10 years. We can see a slight drop off. We can see that it's higher participation among the PhDs. But the difference between bachelor's and master's is not very much. A slight drop off, but the major drop off happens later. We'll continue to do more longitudinal studies as we go through, as we write our report. Here, if they're not engaged I think I'm going to go right to here. Many of those with highest degrees in engineering are in, a substantial number are in the orange, which is computers and engineering related. So you see that the yellow is really not in completely other occupations. A lot of that is management, but not engineering management. And the gray in between is just other sciences. This is a pretty interesting chart because it divides engineering into the specific fields. And it asks, how much are they staying within the small specific field that they got their degree in? And that's the blue there. They work in their own specific field. And you see that those numbers are relatively small, smaller than the numbers remaining in engineering, because you have to add the orange. You also see a lot of differences between the fields, so that in civil and architectural engineering, they're much more likely to be in the field that they were trained in. In industrial, not so. And in aerospace, maybe surprisingly, not that much either. The industrial is the one really that doesn't seem to be keeping them within their small sphere. And once again, the orange on the top is the least, not engineering or mostly not engineering related. Here we contrast this a little bit to other fields just to make sure you realize that engineering's not special, in the sense that if you studied math and statistics, there's almost half of you are not anywhere near kind of your science or engineering related at all. So it's not in only engineering where people leave, and in fact, engineering in some ways is better than some of these fields. An interesting thing that the CSTAT survey does is instead of categorizing occupations, for those people who say that they are not working closely in the field, are not working at all in the field of the highest degree, we ask, and even those people are asked, as well as everybody else, does your job relate to your highest degree? So this is more self-reports than categorization. Do you think it does relate to your highest degree? And what we see is that if you include everybody here whose highest degree is in engineering, so these are only people highest degree in engineering, more than 90%, in most of that time, throughout the whole time, there's no drop-off here, throughout the whole time, they are saying that their jobs are either closely or somewhat related. And even the closely related is higher than we saw in terms of the categorization into engineering occupations. So how we measure it is one thing. How they perceive their own jobs, more than 90% think that they're working closely to their, in fields closely to their highest degree in engineering. And here, we divided people Perhaps the one on the right is the most interesting one. These are people who are not working in engineering, in computers and engineering related, and still almost 70% say that their jobs are related to their highest degree, which was in engineering. So their self-perception is somewhat different than how we categorize the occupations. They are still perceiving themselves as working in a closely to their highest degree in engineering or somewhat closely. Do their jobs require technical expertise, which also is related to, is it engineering? If you have a degree and a job in engineering, almost every single one requires that. But even 72% of those who don't have a specifically engineering job need that technical expertise. And the people working in engineering who don't have engineering degrees, they also need that expertise. So this tells a similar story somewhat. These people are definitely working in something that is technical and they perceive to be closely related to their degree. Why do they leave? For those of people who say they are not working in the area of degree, so this is just the smaller percentage, why? So this is a cross-section of the reasons, and you can see that the most important reason is pay and promotion, although a job not being available is also quite important. These are bachelor's and master's again. 17% have changed their professional interests. Absolutely. Okay, the next one's also about reasons, but take a look at all of the others. The pay and promotion is the largest. Job not available is also quite important there, up there with 25%. And this breaks the same kind of thing up. However, it breaks them up. First, the far left is people who are within 5 years of their degree, of their highest degree in engineering. And then we see the next 5 years. What's interesting about this? Well, one of the things that we see is that pay and promotion's not important very early in their career. But what's really important if they're not working in engineering, it seems to be that job was not available. That's the green. By 6 to 10 years later, there's much less green, especially at the bachelor's level. Although there's the green at the master's level is grown. The bachelor's, where it was particularly a shortage of jobs, they found those jobs related to their highest degree. And here at the bachelor's level is where they now get quite unhappy and say to themselves, wait a minute, do I have pay and promotion opportunities? And that's why they might be leaving working in engineering. By the way, I guess we didn't say this, but you will notice some of these slides are somewhat different than what you have. We kind of thought about it, read them over, wanted to add some things. So this is somewhat different than what you had, and some of those other slides are as well. We apologize, and this will be on the website, this latest one. For those of you who believe in regression, which I do, I have 2 regressions here. I hope to do more in the future, exploiting the longitudinal nature. This is just 2010 cross-sectional data, looking at people, first of all, to see, are you still engaged in engineering? And what we see here, all those stars up there in time from degree, it says that there's definitely a drop-off, although the drop-off gets, as we saw in the picture, more that flattens up as time goes by. And that we see this drop-off is true both whether you have the highest degree in engineering or any degree in engineering. Women, we see, are more likely to leave. They're less likely to be engaged in engineering, about 8.5% less likely. And of the different degree levels, the masters are the most likely to stay in engineering. So All in all, we say, although people with engineering degrees frequently do not work in engineering, 90% report that their degrees they're using those degrees in their work, and more than 85% are in engineering, computers, or engineering-related jobs. Recent graduates often work outside their field for lack of jobs, but those who work outside of engineering more than 5 years, the primary reason they leave is for pay and promotion. And another highlight is that first pie chart saying that 21% of those working in engineering jobs do not have any engineering degrees. I just want to briefly talk about earnings before Donna takes over again. We wanted to compare, once again, this is the 2010 data. We wanted to compare the earnings, since earnings change so much over the people's lives. This is earnings as a function or changing as the years from their degree changes. These are people whose highest degree is in engineering. And the black line, does it look black? Whatever. The dark line is engineering. So one thing you see right away, now these are bachelors, they're getting paid more than in other fields, than people who have had other majors. And that's true throughout their career. Masters, particularly true, even more true as the careers went on. So I bet you Kitty's going to tell me in a second, let that soak in. This is pretty interesting. So I'll just let you take a look at it and see the pattern. Not all of this, some of this might be because they're different cohorts. Some of the differences over time, they are different cohorts. But relative to the other fields is quite an interesting fact. This is, I've divided here, it's kind of the same thing. It's more discontinuous because it's year by year. But I wanted to see the difference between those whose highest degree is in engineering and work in engineering, compared to those whose highest degree is engineering but not working in engineering. So that was the blue versus the orange. And the gray is highest degree in engineering, not working in either engineering, computers, or related to engineering degree areas. What's amazing here is that they're all on top of each other. There's practically the same salary path for every engineer, irrespective of the occupation we put them into. This, those of you who are, engineers might find this particularly interesting. How much do you get relative to other engineers? This is 2010 data in 2010 dollars, and the blue is actually at very beginning, and the orange is later on, more towards the peak of your career, 21 to 30 years. And you can see the differences. The salaries, the blue ones, somewhat similar. The red ones, you can see that aerospace and biomedical a little bit higher, but they're all high, but several fields stand out. Aerospace, biomedical, engineering, chemical, relative to industrial, for instance, electrical, computer, et cetera. Et cetera. No, sorry, not the electrical, but the industrial does not look very good, and civil not as good as some of the others as well. So once again, as an economist, I wanted to do, this is the regression of the log salary, so you can interpret these numbers as percentage changes. So I want to concentrate on the top two lines. If you're working in engineering, this positive, very significant says, coefficient says you're between 14 and 19%. And you have your highest degree in engineering, working in engineering increases your salary by something between 14 and 19%. So working in engineering is profitable. We were concerned that perhaps it was not, and that's why some people were leaving, but on average, it's profitable for the ones who stay. And we did this with two different populations, one with highest degree, one with any degree in engineering. The story is the same. And the second of each set says, if you compare engineering to engineering related or computers, it's still true that working within engineering is better, and both of them are better than working in other jobs. Controlling for time from degree, etc. Oh, sorry. So Donna's going to take over at this point, and she's also going to summarize these results, which is well, I'll just let you do it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, so if there were a surplus of engineers, as economists, we would see their wages being depressed. We don't really see that in the data. And this is 2010 data. It's 2014. Wages evolve over time. But the indication is that, the salaries are pretty good. It's good to be an engineer. And they're happy, right? This is the percent satisfied. 92% with a degree and a job in engineering are satisfied. If they're not working in engineering, but they have a degree, they're 90% satisfied. And if they're if they have no degree, but they're working in an engineering job, they're less satisfied, but still pretty pleased. For those who are working in an engineering occupation, but are dissatisfied, the leading dissatisfaction is opportunities for advancement. So we interpret this as there not being a technical advancement track in engineering. Job security, intellectual challenge, principal job benefits, salary, contribution to society, there's usually 13 to 15%. Degree of engineers, about 8% feel that they don't have enough independence. What do they do in terms of their work activities? This is a series of questions that they use to assign people to occupations. And those who are working in engineering occupations with an engineering degree, they're either managing or product development as their primary work activity. Product design, and to a lesser extent, product development. They're not doing human resources, which is at the bottom. This is engineers in other occupations that are not engineering, and you see that they're managing as before. And a lot of them are in the engineering-related occupation of computer programming. Some have moved into sales and product development. Again, they're not doing human resources. So to summarize the earnings and satisfaction, engineers earn more than other STEM disciplines, and this is consistently true. Engineers working in engineering are engaged in management and product development and design. Those in non-engineering occupations are managing. And they're satisfied with their work on average. But the dissatisfaction is that they're not happy with careers for advancement if they're in an engineering occupation. So we break this down into the overall strengths and weaknesses as we summarize what I view as a statistical portrait of the engineering workforce education continuum. Individuals with engineering degrees work in a variety of occupations besides engineering, computers, engineering related, but they view their work as being closely related to the training that they're receiving in the university. So regardless of where they work, they're highly paid, they are very satisfied, and when they do their work, it's with designing new product and processes and managing those activities. There are issues of concern, but not, if you put this in the context of other STEM disciplines, again, I say this is a very happy story. The one sort of issue of concern that resonated with us as we think about gender, race, ethnicity issues is that engineering is less diverse than the US population, especially in terms of race and gender. And the workforce and the population is becoming more diverse. And so the people going into engineering are very different than the population as a whole. Over half of the engineering PhDs are foreign-born, and immigration policy has implications for retaining the best talent in the United States. Engineers who do leave for pay and promotion reasons, and this is a consideration for the corporate interests out there. And there is dissatisfaction for engineers in engineering occupations for opportunities with advancement. So thank you.
Okay. So Donna and Shu, very good. Thank you. Very, very insightful. Before we move on to the Q&A portion with the audience, I would like to invite up Julia Lane, who is one of our more spirited study committee members, and she wants to provide some of her reflections and remarks. And Julia, let's do it in 10 minutes, please.
Sure. I think that's putting it a little strongly. I didn't want to. I was told I had to make comments. So let's set the record straight here. So I thought that was a very useful description of what's going on and very responsive to the charge of the committee. I think as you think through how to structure this and provide guidance to the committee in its deliberations, there might be some things that you want to look at. So not all of us are expert in CSTAT, and one of the things that was very confusing was whether you were talking about stocks and flows throughout. And let me tell you why that's important. So, you know, economists are, the simplest way that we think about labor markets, and labor markets for a particular type of skill, is you think about demand and supply. And the adjustment to the labor market, to the supply of individuals who are coming in, you've got an existing stock of people who are working, and they are going to move in and out in response to a variety of different signals. So you want to get a sense of those inflows and the outflows, okay? And if you don't understand that, then you don't understand what's going on in the labor market, and that's where I was getting muddled, because I wasn't seeing, I was getting confused as to whether we were looking at a pooled cross-section over all periods from 2003 to 2010, whether I was looking at people who were getting degrees in a particular year, or all people who had degrees over the whole period. And the reason that that matters is you can get new people flowing in as they get credentialed, right? And we saw something about that. They're going to be responding to a large extent to current or market conditions 3 or 4 years prior, which is when they decide to go into it. So you're going to want to have some kind of story about why BAs and masters are flowing in, and the potential for that to change the stock of the current number of people working in engineering. So if there are, for example, I'm making it up, 200,000 engineers, we didn't know how many total engineers there were. If there are 200,000 engineers and there are 8,000 or 200,000 bachelor's engineers and there are 8,000 bachelors coming in every year, that's not really going to change the stock of engineers very much, but if it's over time, that might. And similarly, if you're seeing people flow out, we want to know the order of magnitude of those flows relative to the stock, so we've got some sense of what the level in the labor market is. And that's going to vary a fair bit by age. So one of the things that we know in looking at labor markets over time in lots of different areas is that when people are between like 20 and 30, there's a lot of chopping. They change jobs a lot, and that's part of a sorting and matching process, and that's actually where a lot of earnings growth occurs. After that, they tend to be their jobs, they tend to stay in their jobs. They're only going to move out of those jobs when they're like 30 to 50, let's say, if there is not a return to experience, right? So their switching is going to depend on their return to experience. So on the experience regressions, so here's the storyline as I understand it for colleagues of mine who are experts in the engineering market. High initial salaries, pretty flat, because the return to experience is pretty low because your problem-solving capacities don't grow substantially in the engineering. You want to have the young people come in who can do things better. So it'd be really nice to see that story, because if that's the case, and the outflows of the older cohort are because there isn't a return to experience, that may be the market signaling to the old guys, I'm an old guy now, that may be telling them, get out. You know, you're good for the first 20 years, then when you're in your 40s, go off and do management or become president of Chaos to do something equally useful, right? So it may be that the wage, so one of the things that we did see is the wage signal, which is the way in which economists think. We saw some allusion to the fact that the wage signals were working as you would expect, but I got a bit frustrated with the description because we had a lot of quantity discussions, but we didn't have any discussion about the wage patterns over those periods for those different people. So we went right to the regressions rather than saying, oh, what's happened to the wages across those periods. And you'll notice that that's actually where Dr. Mott came in and said that is the way in which the engineering market is operating, right? Jobs disappear, industries disappear, new industries come in, and you get reallocated from one industry to another, and it's the price mechanism that's making that work. And I'm got to stay within my 10 minutes. So my last comment is, it would be really helpful on every slide to understand what groups are being looked at, because it seemed to be switching, and in particular in the regressions, if I don't know what the comparator group is, I don't know what the earnings premium is relative to, and I don't know what the experience premium is relative to. So I thought it was terrific, really useful, really interesting, but it'd be great to have a contextual framework in which we can interpret the quantity, the price, and the relative age relative to the time dimension effects. So thank you very much.
Thank you. By the way, I should have mentioned, and as I said earlier, there are more. Let's move to questions. Questions? Yes, here we go.
If I can just ask, we have 2 microphones over here. We have one we can float, but our colleagues on the web can't hear the questions unless you use a microphone. If you can identify yourself, name, and institution, please.
Sherry Shepard, mechanical engineer by education and trade. So in looking at foreign-borns, it's interesting that you used that definition, because I'm wondering how those numbers would change if you grouped citizens and permanent, residents, because I was actually surprised at the nearly 17% of undergraduates being foreign-born, and maybe it's in that definition.
I think this speaks to Julia's stock and flow issue. This is sort of looking at the stock of people with engineering degrees in 2010. And so if we divided this by visa status, there'd be lots of little lines, and so we didn't really do that. We can do that in additional analyses. But we just wanted to see, so how many people were not, who would be considered immigrants are here and in these degrees in the U.S. in 2010.
Yeah. It will be interesting for the committee to potentially talk about that too, because some schools are more aggressively recruiting foreign-born students because the tuition is higher.
Exactly.
And so to what extent are those policies affecting that number?
Well, and sending countries, right? There are a number of countries send their students here. They do so in economics. I would presume they would do so in engineering. They send their students here to get the training and bring it back. Some end up staying, a lot end up going back. And so it's a way of sort of coming and taking advantage of the best higher education in the world in many cases, and then disseminating it throughout their countries of origin.
Yes, Leonard Bowman from Michigan Technological University. I was taken aback a little bit by what I thought was an apparent disconnect between what workers' perceptions of them working in engineering and the job classification. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit about how that job classification comes about and reasons perhaps that there is this disconnection between the workers' perception and how the jobs are classified.
So there's an expert in the room about how occupations are classified in CSTAT, NIMI. Could you... classifying occupations is like the closest thing to sausage I've ever seen in terms of data. So I'll let Nimi talk about it.
Hi, my name is Nimi Cannon-Cuddy. I'm from the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. The data in CSTAT, there's multiple ways that we classify people so you can do the kinds of analysis that Donna and Shu did today. The first way we classify people is by their field of degree. It's pretty straightforward. We ask people their degree fields, and then they tell us what those fields they pick from a list, and it's pretty accurate. The next thing we do is we ask them to tell their occupation. Their occupation is a very different thing than degree field. Degree field you can kind of think of as a body of knowledge that somebody has. Occupations in a federal context, in our surveys, any other federal survey, is defined by the work activities that somebody does. It has absolutely nothing to do with training. The actual definitions don't mention the training at all. It has to do with the work that they do. So in terms of our surveys, we tell people, tell us your job title, tell us what you do in your job, and then pick a code. And then we have folks look at it to make sure it meets the standard occupational classification definitions. So that's essentially what we do. And then that's why we ask the other questions. How related is the job? How much technical expertise do you need in your job? And this is really so we can understand these different facets of an individual in the labor market.
Thank you.
Okay.
Donna Riley, National Science Foundation. I have two questions. One I think is quick, so I'm going to try to ask both of them because I think Nimi knows the answer to this one too. But I'm wondering how engineering technology is being dealt with in this analysis. Is it an engineering field? Is it a related field? Is it not in this study? And that I think raises questions about both 2-year degrees and 4-year degrees. And it seems like you started with bachelor's, but I'm wondering about the role of the 2-year degree in this. And then the second question, maybe that wasn't as short as I thought, but the second question is about the undergraduate engineering education studies that talk about leaving sort of present engineering as this reverse Roach Motel where you can check out, but you can't check back in once you've left. And it seems like the same thing might be happening here, where you see people leaving engineering, but I'm wondering if there are other fields that see an increase, because that's true in higher ed. You see people leaving engineering, but their numbers are increasing in other disciplines, because they're picking other disciplines. Does that make sense? The question makes sense?
I'm not sure, but I'll try to answer it anyway. So first of all, let me just say that when you say engineering technology, that's what we call the engineering related. They're not officially called engineers, but they're engineering technologists. We would love to have 2-year degrees. We do not. CSTAT doesn't include it. But some people are getting BAs in those, and those people, or are working in them even if they have other degrees. So we call that engineering related. But to the extent it's engineering, that's why we wanted to say maybe you have to include these too. And there's a sense in which, kind of following the other question, that once you start including those, you approach numbers very similar to this picture about, is your degree related? We're talking 85 to 90% are either in engineering or engineering related or computers, or say their degree, if you have a highest degree in engineering, they say, yes, my job is closely related. So I do want to say that. And I just want to say something about returning to engineering. We could do more, but I looked for the people that I followed through time. I did look at year-to-year individuals, and I was just shocked because, once again, it's a definitional thing. So they might be engineering, not engineering, engineering, or not engineering, engineering. I mean, there was every single pattern was in there. So if by the definition of engineering, they are coming in and out, and maybe I should take the larger definition of engineering and also look at that to see whether there is a lot of, whether it is a roach motel or not.
Well, and this also speaks to the difficulty with classifying people by occupation. Every 10 years, the definitions of occupations change. And, you know, so the people who assign occupations, it's not your self-report. It's, you know, your degree, your industry, your what you say your work activities, and then somebody in Jeffersonville, Indiana, makes a judgment call. So, I mean, it's kind of it's not a science by any stretch of imagination when you're assigning people to occupations.
Okay, good. So let me take one more question here, and I want to take a question from the web. So,
Russell Jones, lifelong engineering educator, currently consulting in the startup of new universities in emerging countries. I've looked ahead at the information. I've looked at the information you provided so far. I found a big gap in not looking at what government policy has in terms of quantity of engineers, for example, distribution of engineers. I got dragged into a PhD by the National Defense Education Act. My whole generation is now retired, and the NAE has tried to push hard to get another similar act to get advanced degrees in engineering. It hasn't happened. Right now, the Department of Education is pushing very hard with the stimulus from the president to push technical education into more get ready for the job at day one. A whole different perspective than when I was an engineering educator, saying, hey, we're preparing people for 40 or 50-year degrees, build a base, let's get some experience to start with, and eventually they will be productive out there in year 5, 10, 15. Well, what is the impact of that kind of thing? What's happening now with the close down of the sector that Mr. Duncan wants to close down, which is this whole for-profit enterprise, which again is trying to turn out people for technical fields who can work right now. Government impact somehow in the study doesn't seem to be being recognized.
So I'll take a step back from that question and talk about the government impact in terms of be careful what you wish for. What science field has the most government involvement? Biomedicine, right? The NIH is the largest science funding organization in the world. They support graduate education. If you want a PhD in biomedicine, you can get it, but good luck getting a job, right? So yes, policy matters, and sometimes too much policy can create unintended consequences. In terms of the for-profit industry, I think the jury is out. I mean, I think it might be good for technical jobs, but for the advanced degrees, I don't view sort of like online education, for-profit education, as incentive compatible for the students who are pursuing degrees. And so far, the labor market does not seem to take those degrees as seriously as it does the traditional bachelor's degrees or associate's degrees. So that would be my sort of immediate response.
Okay, great. Okay, so quick question from the web. This comes from Prism Magazine, Burr Benderly. And the question reads, we hear a great deal about engineers, especially in the tech or computer industry, being laid off after age 35 or so. This does not seem to reflect in the data shown. Am I missing something?
We're not doing a deep dive into information technology and computer science type jobs. I think the nature of that work, it's especially software, is much more easy to outsource, and there's a significant amount of outsourcing to foreign countries in computer science and info technology jobs. So that may be the case. I'm doing another project with the Sloan Foundation on women in computer science, and so 6 months from now, I may be in better shape to answer that. But so we're looking at engineering specifically. Some of those people with engineering degrees are working in computer science and information technology, but we're looking more broadly.
Okay, good. Excellent, ladies. Thank you very much.
There was one other question there.
Can we get you on the next round?
Sure. Actually, it was just a request for the follow-up in terms of the foreign-born. From an industrial perspective, my name is Maureen Reitman, and I'm from Exponent. Very interested in seeing some of the analysis related to PhDs, and in particular, I'm very interested in hearing about the breakdown that goes with, are you legally authorized to work permanently in the United States?
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, so let's go to part two of this session one. And a reminder, the session is the educational and career pathways of engineering talent. Ladies, thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. So I'd like to invite up Samantha Brunhaver. And just a quick introduction. Samantha is the assistant professor for Arizona State University. And she's going to spend about, the next 20 to 25 minutes dialoguing on this topic. So, Sam.
I have one just like it.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm going to be talking about my doctoral work. My doctoral work was based on 2 NSF studies on engineering pathways of engineering students and early career engineers. And today I'm going to be focusing specifically on findings about the work and careers of early career engineering graduates. Why those individuals specifically? Well, a lot of research has been done in aggregate on engineers and also on engineers 10 to 15 years out, why they leave, what kind of skills do they need in their work. Early career engineering graduates are often overlooked, and so as a complement to the large national data set that you just saw, this work is going to take a more nuanced, targeted look at the work and careers of these graduates using interviews and a smaller, more targeted survey. Before I jump into that, though, I'd just like to pose this question for you for a couple of seconds. What comes to mind when you hear the word engineer? There's been a lot of words thrown out today, but just think about that. Think about what students might think. A lot of different perspectives are probably in this room, but I took this question to my sophomores in engineering design last week, and I just posed a question, what do you guys think engineering is? And I got answers such as the following: an engineer is someone who applies math and science, someone who uses theory and equations, they design and build stuff, and they solve difficult problems to improve the world. I got answers like this. And so it really does elicit an image of engineering as mathy, science, technical. But when you look at what reports like the NAE Engineer of 2020 says engineers should be, that's really only a third of what engineering graduates should have. So not only do they need to be technically competent, they also need to be socially savvy, having the interpersonal skills to work in teams and communicate with other people. They also need to be contextually aware of things like the global economy that they're now working in. And so it's a little bit concerning why they're really only taking this 1/3 away from their education, and thinking about, well, why is that? When you look at engineering programs today, a lot of the times we're teaching engineering like we practiced it 100 years ago. So individuals working alone at desk, doing pen and paper calculations, not really talking to anyone. If you go into a lecture hall, you might see something that looks a lot like that. And that's concerning. It's sending a message to students that is narrow, it's outdated, it's homogenous, everyone's sort of doing the same thing. And that's not really what is happening in practice today. So the focus of my work and the focus of what's done at the Designing Education Lab at Stanford has been to try to understand the work and occupations of early career engineering graduates. Again, because they hold the key to really understanding how to improve the school to work transition for this unique group of individuals. And from that, use that understanding to improve academic programs in professional workplaces so that, again, we can ultimately facilitate this transition from being an undergraduate in engineering to being an early career professional. So now that I've laid out the framework, I'll define a few things and then explain the data that I have. When I talk about early career engineering graduates today, what I'm referring to are graduates with engineering bachelor's degrees. They have less than 5 years of post-school work experience. So they've only been out in the world doing engineering for 0 to 5 years. I'm going to, again, be presenting two data sets, one qualitative, another quantitative. And the qualitative one, we call it the Young Working Engineers Study. This was a study of interviews with around 40 working engineers from 4 different companies in the United States, different industries, so a computer company, an auto manufacturer, a small state agency here in DC, and another manufacturing company. All of them have 0 to 36 months of experience on the job. Some have bachelor's, others have master's. And this study was part of a larger NSF-funded study, a research center actually, the Center for Advancement of Engineering Education, which was funded from 2003 to 2010. So my first set of findings will come from there. And then I'll talk about findings from a recent engineering alumni study called Pathways of Engineering Alumni Survey, or PAIRS. We surveyed around 500 alumni from 4 engineering colleges in the United States. These individuals had earned their degrees 4 years before we surveyed them. So they were out in grad school or in the workforce for roughly 4 years. And this was part of a larger NSF engineering pathway study. So I'm going to jump into the first set of findings from the qualitative study. And this set of findings is really going to be looking at the nuances of the work that early career engineering graduates do. And in these interviews with working engineers in their workplaces, we followed something called the critical incident technique, where we asked them to talk about specific incidents and situations that they had found themselves in. So a typical prompt with this technique is, tell me about a time when ... fill in the blank. And so we asked them, tell me about a time when you had to apply technical skills to solve a hard engineering problem in your work. We also asked them, tell me about a time when you had to use your social skills to navigate the social milieu of your work, and what did you learn? And we also asked them, what are some of the similarities and differences between your work and your engineering program? What are the kind of things that you're struggling with? What do you wish you had been better prepared in? And from those interviews, coding and analyzing them, we came up with a set of topics that these working engineers seem to really be struggling with. Some of them are things that we've seen before in other work, and then others are, I think, unique in that they're not often highlighted. So in some, the gaps implicated by early career engineers in these interviews had to do with non-technical skills, cross-disciplinarity, having initiative, and knowing the difference between collaboration and teamwork. And what each of these means, I'm going to actually walk through them with some quotes and examples so that, again, you can get a feel of what they were actually experiencing and struggling with. So first, this is no surprise, but a very common theme was having to do non-technical kinds of work. So having to work with other people, having to do project management. I think these individuals had some inkling that they had to do this, but they really didn't expect to have to do it so much. They thought that they were really going to be doing mostly technical work, and so this really is something that they struggled with. So much so that a lot of young engineers were really questioning, I'm an engineer, I have the title engineer, but am I really doing engineering work? They weren't really sure at that point. Another thing they struggled with was the degree of cross-disciplinarity in their work. So for example, there was a food manufacturing company with a lot of chemical engineers. So they were definitely doing chemical processes like you would imagine. And this is another chemical refinery, different examples of chemical engineering that they talked about. But then you also had chemical engineers in different situations where they were in bunny suits working on semiconductors. And they really, I think that this goes back to the discussion about engineering graduates and can they really find the job that they want. Maybe the job they want is not available, and they ended up in another job. But you had engineers, chemical engineers doing semiconductor work saying, hey, I wasn't ever prepared that I was going to do this kind of work. I didn't expect that this is the kind of work I was going to do, even when I took this job at this company. I'm not really sure where all the chemical engineering processes and equipment are. Something else that they talked about feeling uncomfortable with and struggling with was initiative in their work. So new engineers, oftentimes, they're thrown in the mix, they don't really know what to do, and they have to work their way out of it by asking questions and asking for directives. But sometimes they just weren't comfortable with that. You have engineers who want or need something, they see an opportunity, but they don't get to act on it because they don't speak up for themselves. They feel like they would be imposing on their manager. Or even worse, they get behind in their work because they didn't say something when they should have. So this was a common theme in the interviews. And then finally, there is a lot of emphasis on teamwork in undergraduate engineering education, but the working engineers in the study struggled with the differentiation between teamwork as it's taught in school and collaboration as it happens in the workplace, and knowing that there's a difference. So to illustrate what I mean, I have a classroom here full of students working. I don't really know if you can see very well, but what you're essentially looking at is a bunch of teams working on engineering statics in different project teams. And they're all working on the same thing, they're working on it together, same timeline, same goal. Contrast this with what you see in companies like Intel and others where you have cubicle farms. And so yes, people come together and they meet and they talk and they work on things, but then they go back to their own space, they work on their individual contribution to the project, maybe they have their own timelines, they're working on several different projects, people are coming and going at different instances in the timeline, and so teamwork does not really happen in the workplace as it happens in school. And so some young engineers remarked on this, and they said, I don't really feel like I'm part of a team here. Everyone has their own projects, they're doing their own thing. I don't feel like I'm part of a team, and I don't understand what the big fuss about teamwork was when I was a student. So they're not seeing that connection. So based on these set of findings, it lends itself to some recommendations, both for educators and employers. So for educators, The recommendation would be to promote learning that develops these often overlooked skills. So project-based learning is a great way that students can get experience with the non-technical skills like project management and communication. There's self-directed learning so that they actually learn initiative in class so that when they get in the job, they feel comfortable speaking up for themselves, knowing that they have to find information. Applications-based learning to bring home the cross-disciplinarity, having people apply their disciplinary knowledge to different disciplinary contexts. And cooperative learning, which is a type of team-based learning where each student has a different role and they're responsible for that role, as opposed to having everyone just responsible for everything, working on everything at the same time. It's a more structured way of having more authentic teaming experiences. And then for employers, the implication is more can be done to provide them with resources and support to navigate the school-to-work transition. Onboarding programs when they first come in so that they can get an overview of the organization that they're in and the kind of work that they're responsible for. On-the-job training where they can work side by side with other engineers to figure out their specific work roles and responsibilities. That's also covered under senior and peer mentoring. Having someone to actually talk to and say, I don't know, I know I'm supposed to be asking for things myself, but I'm not even sure what to ask for, those kind of questions. And also being able to give them regular feedback and reviews periodically. This can help them. And in fact, as a part of the study, one of the sponsoring companies was General Motors, and in response to these findings, they actually implemented a number of initiatives for their new engineers to help them out. So for example, setting out a mentoring program where senior engineers actually got incentives for taking time out to mentor these young engineers. So there are pointers to indicate that doing some of these things actually does affect their satisfaction and feelings of integration and socialization on the job. So that summarizes the first part, the first set of findings that I have about the nature of the work done by actual engineering graduates who choose to do engineering work. But if you look at NSF statistics, and based on what we heard today, that doesn't cover all engineers. That only covers roughly 60% of all young engineers that actually go into engineering occupations. The other 40% choose things that are not strictly classified as engineering, maybe because they feel that they're not prepared to do engineering work, maybe because they actually identified skills like maybe they have initiative, maybe they have cross-disciplinary interest, and they take those interests and go to other fields. I think that's something to be discussed. But the next part of my presentation is going to really look at the broader view of what kind of careers do early career engineering graduates take and how we can better classify them as engineers or not. So how do we define engineering for this group of individuals? So again, this was from a survey called Pathways of Engineering Alumni Research Survey. And we asked a lot of questions on this survey to graduates from 4 schools 4 years out about their undergraduate experiences and pre-college experiences. But we also asked a fair number of questions about their current occupation and current position. And one of those questions was about what is your current and primary employed position in terms of title. We gave them a series of drop-down lists with job titles. These lists were actually based on the National Survey of Recent College Graduates, which is a part of CSTAT. So we gave them the titles based on CSTAT, and we asked them, choose the one that best describes you. And depending on what they chose, we bin them in 2 categories, either working in engineering occupations if they selected specific subfields. Anyone else was classified as non-engineering occupations based on this question that they answered. And from that, from the sample, we saw that 70% were employed in an engineering titled occupation, and the remainder were employed in non-engineering occupations. 11% of those were in science or science and engineering related occupations as they've been defined in the previous talk. And the 19% remaining were in non-science and engineering occupations. And if you look at the breakdown that you get from the 2008 NSF NSRCG data, this is actually a very similar breakdown. And so we're able to show some similarities with that data set, but then we're also able to take that a step forward because, again, this was a more targeted survey. We were able to ask more questions about position. And to President Mo's points earlier today, self-identification is so important, so we also asked questions about self-identification. And specifically we asked, would you describe your current employed position as either engineering or non-engineering? We didn't define in any way what these terms were. We didn't really put anything else to that question other than what you see here. And respondents were supposed to, for themselves, decide, am I an engineer or am I not an engineer? How would I describe my position? And therefore, combining the self-report measure with an occupation measure, I was able to create a 2x2 framework to map all my respondents onto this framework to say how does their occupation and self-report interact, and what kind of groups come out of this. And I used this framework to come up with a more inclusive, broader definition of engineering. So can I use this framework to that end, and what do I find? And so the groups that came out are the four in the framework. So we have definite engineers. These were people who were in engineering titled occupations, and they definitely said, I'm an engineer. So these are the true and blue engineers. There's also the nominal engineers who said that they were working in an engineering titled occupation, but they did not feel strongly enough about their position to say, I'm in an engineering position. They actually said, I'm in a non-engineering position. And these include people like first-line engineering management, who you can imagine might have felt conflicted between, am I a manager, am I an engineer, et cetera, et cetera. Following that, there's the definite non-engineers. They're definitely not in an engineering occupation by title, and they also definitely don't see themselves as engineers, and so they are definitely non-engineers. And then finally, what I've titled non-traditional engineers. This is a special and unique group. They might be titled non-engineer based on NSF-based classifications, but they definitely see themselves as still practicing engineering and using their engineering degree. And so what I did to pull out these comparisons between these groups, I just combined the first two because as you see, the nominal engineering group was very, very small. So I combined the two groups up top just as a general engineering group because I wanted to be inclusive in addition. So just engineers, comparing them with definite non-engineers and non-traditional engineers. And how do they stack up on additional measures related to their current position, such as the skills and knowledge that they think are important in their work, and then the degree of relatedness between their job and their education. So this was a measure based on the CSTAT data system as well. And again, a very unique special group. Not surprisingly, these non-traditional engineers were more similar to engineers than to the definite non-engineers groups on competencies important to their work, especially the technical competencies, math and science, planning and conducting experiments, engineering techniques and tools. And I should mention that these skills I mentioned were part of a larger list of skills that we asked about that were influenced by the Engineer of 2020 list and ABET A through K outcomes. And then they were also more similar to engineers on their degree of job relatedness. They did feel strongly that they were using their education, whereas definite non-engineers felt less so, like they were. So, in recommendation here, broadening our definition of engineering to include these non-traditional engineers can really open the space of the images that we share with students, how we classify people in terms of their occupations. And the data really suggests that a lot of the kinds of occupations discussed today that would fall in this category they do feel that they are using their degree by self-report. These include technical managers, technicians and programmers, technical salespeople, software developers, and also other non-traditional roles that might not otherwise be seen. So for example, in our sample, there was a lot of there was a few Army engineers, Air Force engineers, and technically speaking, or strictly speaking, they'd be classified as military personnel, but they too are being overlooked as engineers. So I hope that these findings have helped broaden understanding and discussion of work and occupations that early career engineering graduates do, so that again we can improve academic programs and professional workplaces to facilitate this transition to early career professionals. These two NSF studies that I mentioned have looked at a number of other topics that might be of interest related to early career engineers. For example, skill and identity formation, more about the specific experiences that they have on the job and the factors influencing their choice of careers. And I'd like to just acknowledge my research collaborators on this work. Some of them are here today, so my advisor, Dr. Sherry Shepard, Dr. Shannon Gilmartin will be joining us today, and they're more than happy to talk about this work as well. NSF and Stanford was responsible for funding the work, and I'm happy to share any publications referenced in this presentation, or continue on the discussion. So my information is up there, and we also have a Dell Designing Education Lab website.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Sam, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to invite up Nicole Smith. And Nicole is a research fellow and senior economist from Georgetown University.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've noticed with all of the speakers, we have a bunch of economists who have been tasked with commenting on it. So I would first begin by apologizing. I know most of us tend to look at things through economic lenses and through wages and salaries. But I want to start off by first thanking Samantha and congratulating her for asking the correct type of questions. I felt that especially the two data sources she used, they sought to answer particular questions that were interesting for the new recent graduates in engineering. The 41 engineers surveyed over time can give you information, very in-depth information on a little bit of the nitty-gritty and the qualitative that is much beyond what's available in national surveys. So I really like that because I spend a lot of time looking at national surveys as well. One of the first points I wanted to talk about was her definition of what sophomores say in engineering is. And engineering is someone who applies math and science, uses theory and equations, designs and builds stuff, and solves difficult problems. So I think from looking at this, I would have thought that I'm an engineer as well. But the point, no, I'm actually not an engineer. But the point I wanted to make here is the diffusion of talent and the diversion of engineering talent, and as one of the reasons that we find that so many people seem to leave the profession. And I want to speak to even Donna and Shu's research today. We spent a lot of time talking about what happens and even examining some of the cognitive reasons for why people leave the profession without any emphasis on the non-cognitive. So I'll talk about that in a little detail. But in looking at Samantha's topic on the recent engineers, one of the first questions I would ask is, well, why? Why do people still pursue engineering? And it's still a discipline that there's a lot of positive aspects to it. When we look at engineers, we find it's one of the lowest levels of unemployment, especially for the recent grads. There's a significant amount of penetration across occupations. So even for those that end up flailing a bit, because most of us do when you first graduate, engineers tend to be able to land themselves on soft cushions. And if you compare engineering majors to other types of majors, they usually start off pretty okay relative to other majors. And stay there for a while and then eventually take off, especially when they move to other types of disciplines. So in asking ourselves why many people still consider engineering, especially the recent grads, one of my concerns is about the career competencies. Samantha talked about, I think, defining engineers and what happens to them later on, and you show that 70% of them tend to stay in the occupation. One concern for me in this research would be the development pathways that we've observed. Are these pathways any different by demographics? Have we observed any types of differences in where people end up depending on whether their gender or their race? And again, I keep stepping on the very first presentation because that's one of my questions as well for that group. When you threw up pictures on people leaving the occupation, and I saw significant portions in industrial engineering, my first thought is, well, is that a gender effect? Are you looking at the fact that there might be more women in industrial, and that's why they're leaving as well? So I think what would be interesting for me to see is also, different pathways developed by demographics. I also want to look at the question, have we delved into non-cognitive reasons for the transition outside of engineering? And the reason I'm asking this is another data set, and then most of you have heard of it, will know some of the problems, and I'll just pretend that I'll just pretend the problems away for a moment. But when you look at the ONET data set, the Occupational Network Database, which is a set of information that tells you about knowledge, skills, abilities, values, interests, and personalities for different types of occupations, defined for over close to 1,000 occupations, you find that once you isolate engineering occupations and you look at the cognitive and non-cognitive competencies associated with engineers end up looking a little bit different from the rest of the world. And it's I find it interesting when Samantha also brought up the topic of teamwork. And whereas, she said, to paraphrase, that some of the students or former students found that, they were required to do a lot more teamwork than they expected in the beginning. Well, this also shows up in ONET, where we find that independence and achievement were some of the interests and values that seem to be significant for the engineering students, much more so than the others. And that also tends to frame satisfaction outside of the job. It also tends to frame how you feel about what you're doing, whether you feel as an individual recognition, and whether you feel that you are able to continue in the field. So my concern here would be whether or not we can, especially in these very well-developed individual surveys where you're following, these students, if we could even ask some of those types of non-cognitive questions, those types of personality questions that help us understand what's going on and why people are leaving the field, and if they're leaving the field. And the very last point I would like to make on this is really looking at what I think to be horizon-type data. We are exploring what the career competencies are. We're exploring what the career pathways are for engineering. We're exploring to the extent to which people stay in engineering. How can we graduate more engineers? How can we ensure that engineers have job satisfaction? How could we ensure that the institutions are pulling their weight? And I think in addition to the two data sets that we've looked at, and of course the very well-defined CSTAT, that we might want to also look at what we are referring to as real-time data, a little bit of that, which essentially is internet job postings. And there are a few organizations that what they do is they go on the website and they scrape all those jobs, and they tell you about the characteristics of those jobs. And the reason why I'm talking about this right now, especially for engineering, is that those jobs that appear on websites tend to have a bias towards bachelor's degrees. And most of the, this discussion here is about engineers with bachelor's degrees, so we can talk a little bit about bachelor's degrees in engineering data. And Brookings has actually spent some time doing that, if you all have paid attention to Jonathan Rothwell's work in Brookings. He's been looking at STEM types of jobs and opportunities, real-time jobs. And he's actually been exploring, or at least his group, they've been exploring the extent to which these competencies are changing over time for STEM and for engineering by extension. And looking at skills gaps in engineering, or skills gaps in STEM by estimating the length of time that it takes for those occupations to be filled online, so they can say, how long are these jobs going unfilled? And we find that there are huge gaps in STEM, which also, make the case for shortages, because we have so many STEM type jobs and so many engineering type jobs in particular locations that are going unfilled for a long time. And also, my final discussion about horizon type data that might be interesting is also resume data, which is also becoming available. And there's Monster and Indeed that's also grouping a bunch of these resume data. And what they've been able to do is, over time, for an individual, they can track your pathway over time. So you can see what your resume that you posted on that website in 1990 looked like, and the same individual who posted the website, posted your resume in 1995, and then posted your resume again years later. How have those jobs changed? So we can get an idea of career pathways. You can isolate engineers and see what's happened over time. These are now becoming available, and of course for sale, but we can still, find some ways of figuring out how engineers have fared over time if we want to talk about developed pathways, especially developed pathways by demographics.
I'll open the floor for questions. We have first question at the mic here.
Okay. Emily Allen from California State University, Los Angeles. This question might be a little bit outside the scope of this work, but is it a bad thing when engineers leave the occupation? And has there been any study of what they are bringing to these other non-engineering occupations, either from their experience or from their education?
So part of my work has looked at what skills are these non-engineers, definite non-engineers, quote unquote, bringing to their occupations, and it seems like where they might think that technical skills aren't really important, they are higher than engineers on things like communication, professionalism, teamwork, the non-technical professional skills of day-to-day work. And so I think that when they're going to these other pathways, it seems like they're definitely bringing skills needed for those particular occupations, and even some of the ones that are not going extremely outside of engineering to just science and engineering related positions, they're still bringing that technical background too. So I think that the data I have suggests that they are contributing value to where they do go. And this data set, we haven't been able to do much more with that, but I do think that there's other researchers who have asked the question, how useful, another potential research question could be, how useful was your education in getting the job that you have? I think that there's a lot of non-engineering fields that want engineers for reasons of having critical thinking skills, being able to be good problem solvers. So I don't have empirical findings to that effect to say so, but I think that we would probably find that the answer is yes, that they do bring value.
If you'll allow me just quickly, the short answer from my perspective is yes, they do bring value, and this is how we've tried to measure it. If you look at engineers who've graduated with a bachelor's degree, irrespective of the occupation that they end up in, and we measure what their wages and salaries are, and we measure their wages and salaries over time, and they're all above average. So that's our definition of the value for it.
Yeah. Good. Good.
Hi, Jeff Ray from Western Carolina University. I'm going to tag along with my colleague from NSF because one of your slides had in it technician, technologist. And Nicole has raised the issue of bachelor's degrees, and thank you. I'm not sure there's a distinguishment going on between a 2-year technician degree and a 4-year technology degree. And I don't want us to get into the issue of what happened with the engineer of 2020, no, the gathering storm, where China was reporting 2-year diploma. I just want to know if we're going to try to clarify that data set. Maybe a comment more than a question.
Well, I'll just jump in since I know a little bit about Sam's. Oh, I'm Sherry Shepard from Stanford. I know a little bit about Sam's data set. So the 4 institutions where she was gathering data from had bachelor's degrees in engineering, and there were no engineering 4-year technology degrees. But you bring up a really good point because there's a healthy number of students graduating with those 4-year technology degrees. One other comment too that hasn't come out, and I would love Nicole and Sam to talk maybe a little bit, the difference you see from different institutions. We've kind of been looking at it as if every bachelor's in engineering is equivalent to every other bachelor's degree, and yet we have 350 engineering schools in the country. Are they all the same? And I think Sam's data starts to address that when she pulls it apart, and I don't know if, Nicole, you have any insights into that too.
So to clarify, to add some details to what Shay is referencing. So the 4 different institutions that we have in our data set, we have a couple large public research universities, a smaller liberal arts institution, and a very technically oriented institution as well. And there are patterns in degrees of going towards engineering versus non-engineering based on the institutional context of the school. So you can imagine that technical schools, they're going to have more technical graduates. The liberal arts, this was Stanford, and so a lot of the culture really lends to students don't necessarily declare a major until junior year. They're exploring different things or involved in different extracurriculars. So it seems logical that they might be more likely to get non-engineering jobs than other people who might be doing a first-year engineering program followed by engineering student chapter organizations and so on, engineering co-ops, very engineering focused. And so depending on the program, matriculation types, and activities available for students, all of these things influence the pathways that they take is what we're finding.
Just a little bit on the 2-year versus the 4-year from that original question. So we also look at what's your highest level of degrees on the ACS data. And since 2010, ACS has actually offered your major, your bachelor's degree. What was your degree since 2010? So we can look at your major and then match that to the occupation given your initial major. So you have the normal hierarchical relationship in wages across, education attainment levels. So you would expect, in general, the AA to earn a little bit less than a BA, the BA to earn less than a master's in general. But we found that for engineering, especially, those types of technician jobs that you're talking about with the associate's degrees, they tend to be outliers, where in the sense that they often earn more than some types of bachelor's degrees, and they can even earn more than some types of master's degrees. I tend not to specifically say which ones because then I get clobbered outside the door, but I can tell you specifically which ones on average. And the usual excuse is, well, after 30 or 40 years, they all taper off. They don't. Even when you look at those career trajectories, once you start off at that lower level at the bachelor's degree and the master's degree, it's really hard to pick up. So that, that excuse that in 30 years you're gonna touch what the engineers started off with and accumulate, it's not necessarily true. I don't see that either.
Okay, great. Al, you have a question?
Thank you. I'm Al Bunshaft. I'm with Dassault Systems. We're an engineering and scientific software company. I'm also the co-leader of a group called the STEM Innovation Task Force, where we have a number of companies attempting to develop what we refer to as a demand-side view of the skills required by employers. So since I mentioned that, I'll start with the comment that our findings and our work, which is attempting to define what those skills are and the categories of those skills, very much aligns to the first study that you showed, that there's a missing skill set around what we're calling experiential learning, which is conveying collaboration, communication skills, interdisciplinary innovation, et cetera. So it very much reinforces what you're saying. And my comment I saw in your findings, I was glad to see in your recommendations, something that I wanted to comment on the first presentation. The data implies that management equals leaving engineering. And I know it seemed to say that there's engineers and then managers as a category of people who have left. And in my 30-year career, I've held numerous management positions that I would say would not be possible to hold without the engineering skills. And I have a final degree in engineering as well. So I think that's maybe a misnomer that we categorize that as not an engineering discipline.
Yeah. So the classification that was used was against CSTAT, and so for those who aren't as familiar with CSTAT, they do have different different levels of management. So the first level management, mid-level, top level, and they classify these levels differently. So first level is considered to be still within your discipline. So an engineering first-line manager is considered to be an engineer, but then as you get to mid-level managers, which they strictly define as a manager of other managers, so a manager of other engineering managers, then you become classified as not engineering. And so I think that some of the interesting things from this data is the fact that we do have, even at 4 years, a number of people who are first-line engineering managers already. We even have people who are mid-level managers already at 4 years. And so even at this level, differentiating between who they are and what they do is important.
Very good. So let me wrap up on one question from the web, and I will invite.
May I ask a question?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you. I'm sorry.
Ann Reimers.
Yes.
I have an undergraduate in mechanical engineering, a master's in mechanical, and a PhD in electrical. I am an Einstein Fellow, so I'm currently not in the field and haven't been for 10 years. My 3 degrees came from 3 different institutions, and in all of those institutions, I never got any training in any of these skills that you're talking about, that are the non-technical skills. I found when I first got out and started working, I took a break between my master's and my PhD, that it was painful to watch engineers do presentations. Truly. So the skills I think that engineers need to get in undergraduate are the interpersonal communication skills in a small group, but also the ability to write technical papers, and the ability to stand up, make a presentation that is at the appropriate level for your audience. So my question to you is I like your recommendations. Who's going to step up and do that? Will it be universities, or will it be, the employers?
I just want to say my university is starting a master's program just for BSs in engineering.
Wonderful.
To teach communication, presentation,
Wonderful.
leadership.
So I would say that it needs to really be both. It needs to be universities and employers might think, okay, what can I do? But they're contributing to this enterprise when they take co-ops and internships, and they use co-ops and internships not to have just someone do grunt work, but actually mentoring them, giving them opportunities to do these presentations, giving them feedback on them so that they have experience, and then even when they're new engineers to do that as well. And so I think that there's skills and ways of enforcing those skills that can happen when you're a new hire engineer, but employers should even be thinking about how do we maximize the learning potential for co-ops and internships when we have them. How can we really turn it into a mentoring thing?
Time for one more question. I'm Nadja Fuad. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Samantha, what did you find gender differences? You have a large sample size. I'm sure you had.
Yes. So another part of this work that I didn't present has been looking at the factors influencing whether people were engineering focused or not engineering focused in their work at 4 years out. And so we did look at demographics like gender. There was a slight difference, so women were slightly less likely than men to be working in engineering focused positions, but it wasn't actually significant. And I think that, I can't remember who it was, but there's a paper that presents a very good argument for that at this stage, women have already gotten the degree, they've persisted, and so perhaps it's not until that next career stage, the mid-level career, that they're conflicted with balancing multiple roles and maybe not getting the pay raises and the opportunities that men are, and that's when the next stage of when this gender difference becomes a problem again. It was my take on it.
Okay, so before the break, I must allow a question in from the web because we've had great participation. And I will invite any of the presenters to comment on this question. The question is from Tony Robinson, and his question is, when looking at why engineers leave the profession, you briefly mentioned gender, race. However, what about age and generational values? Was that also part of the various studies, and how does that affect the data? So the question is around age and generational values. So Donna or Shu, I would also encourage, yeah.
Well, in terms of age, in terms of values, I have nothing to say. In terms of age, if we can look at the cross-section and say that this is applicable across cohort, I mean, in general, and it's an age effect, it seems like at some point it stabilizes and that 40% are there and they're not leaving anymore. So that the big period where they leave is somewhere between 10 and 20 or 8 and 15, 20 years, and then or 15 years, and then it stabilizes more. So for this profession, I'm not saying all science, but for the profession of engineering, it seems to stabilize rather than to dip precipitously at later ages.
Okay, great. Okay, so we will take a break, and what I need you to do, look at your watch or look at your mobile device, add 20 minutes, and we will be back here. Thank you.